Thank you to the Danube Institute and Jerry Frost for inviting me. And I'm always pleased to be back in Hungary, where people seem to be reasonably interested in what I have to say, and to talk about this particular topic, which I know is very important for people in Central Europe. Just what is conservatism, given that it has had such success in the English-speaking world as a political idea and as a political practice. Can it be translated into Central Europe? Can it bring to you the kind of structure in your thinking and your political activity which you need? Will it be an alternative to the kind of centralizing state which seems to be the natural alternative in this, at least in this part of the world, to the kind of fluid democracy that we've achieved in the English-speaking world? Now, I have to say that conservatism is a very difficult thing to define. I'm just going to go through a few thoughts about it and leave it open to Ferenc to criticize me and then to you to ask me questions. It's much easier to say what conservatism is when somebody asks you a question about it, because it doesn't present itself as a philosophy normally. It doesn't say that here is what a conservative believes, here are the axioms and here are the activities. Rather, it is a standing back from the human condition in a reflective posture, asking the deep question, what in this is of value to us? And having found what is valuable, then to try to conserve it, hence the name. But as a philosophy then, rather than a political practice, it's of two kinds. There's a metaphysical conservatism, which has religious roots and which sees the healthy political community as the realization of our higher nature. This is a constantly returning theme in continental thinkers, that there is a metaphysical basis to human life, that we must recapture it, join ourselves to it, and then it will give us the way forward through the dark jungle of empirical facts. But there is also an empirical conservatism which emphasizes the fragility of human achievements and the need to protect them from nihilism, cynicism, and resentment. And I think this is a very important kind of conservatism for this part of the world, where nihilism and cynicism and resentment are part of the historical legacy for various reasons. But nevertheless, it is more the case that continental thinkers take a metaphysical position as opposed to Anglo-American thinkers who take the empirical position. So there I've given you a few suggestions. Metaphysical conservatives include Joseph de Maistre, Hegel, and in our time, thinkers like Voegelin, Galen, and Simone Weil, the French mystic. Empirical conservatives include Hume, Jefferson, Burke, and in our time, Oakeshott and Hayek. Hayek being particularly important in this part of the world, for reasons which I might get onto. So in the political sphere, it's only in English-speaking countries that politicians are comfortable calling themselves conservative. That's a very important fact. Elsewhere, the term is understood as a term of criticism, even a term of abuse. A conservative is someone who is not moving with the times, not progressive, who is clinging to some outmoded form of life or untenable social hierarchy. And this fear of the label conservative is especially prevalent in Germany and France, where the elites cling to the myth that conservatism is on the right, reactionary, and therefore in the same camp as fascism. Now, this is all nonsense, but it's proof, nevertheless, that labels are a potent part of politics. Much of European Union politics consists in name-calling. Martin Schulz and Jean-Claude Juncker are particularly addicted to this, to calling people names in order to silence them or to dismiss what they stand for. And I think this is true, of course, in all walks of human life, in the academic world as well. To be called a conservative in Europe already suggests that you're on the margins in the academic world. A student wrote to me recently, a musicology student who'd been reading my book on the aesthetics of music, saying how important it was for him to read these arguments. And he'd raised the question with his tutors, a PhD student, said, look, I want to go through the arguments in Scruton's book in chapter 3. And his tutor responded, but isn't it conservative? Meaning that I can't possibly encourage you to do this. You must put it aside and return to the works of the unreadable Adorno. So, and I think that is quite normal in the academic world. And you expect it, of course, in all professions where there is competition, that people call each other names, but it's particularly destructive in politics, where there are huge issues that need discussing and a constant attempt to silence the discussion through labels. We're seeing this at the moment with the absurd word Islamophobia, which describes a mental illness which swept across the Western world on the 11th of September 2001. Nobody knows why, but you know, if you're called, if you're accused of Islamophobia, you're out of the discussion. So, what makes a conservatism believable? It's believable, obviously, only if it is also practical. There's no point in a political doctrine which can't be put into practice. My own view is that you must begin from emphasizing the good rather than the evil that surrounds us. Conservatism should not be just a critical stance. It issues from love of what has been achieved and bequeathed to us. And I think this is the major psychological distinction between the conservative and the leftist temperament. Leftism is invariably entangled with resentment of some kind, what Nietzsche called ressentiment, because he thought it was sounded better in French. But the leftist view is that things in the world are out of balance. We are surrounded by injustice, by hierarchies that cannot be justified, by people who exploit and intimidate their fellows. And this must be stopped, this must be overthrown. Whereas I think that conservatism begins, or should begin, from a declaration of love. What it is about that which we have, that we love and wish to protect. And love can be critical, but its fundamental character is one of attachment. Namely, I belong to this, and it belongs to me, like your attitude to your family. This is the root of both the metaphysical conservatism that I referred to and the empirical variety. The European Union propaganda dismisses national sentiment as xenophobia. In other words, it's not love, but hate. It's not that these sentiments that we all feel towards our own come from our love of our own, but from our suspicion and hatred of the others. And this kind of description is characteristic, in my experience, of the liberal left. It exemplifies what Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian who settled in England, brother of a rather obnoxious Hungarian who stayed here, what Michael Polanyi described as moral inversion, that something that looked at one way is a positive thing is turned into its negative by looking at it in another way. And I think this is what we see all the time with the EU's propaganda against the national idea. So I think that the second component of the conservative position, as it's available to us today, is the belief in the nation state. And I think this has deep foundations. Every political community, in my view, depends on a pre-political loyalty, something that binds us together as a we. Just think about it. All of us in democracies live under governments that we didn't vote for. Perhaps you in Hungary, more of you voted for your government than those in Britain who live under our Conservative government. But on the whole, people live under governments that they haven't voted for. In other words, they live governed by people whom they don't really accept. What makes that possible? What makes it possible, in my view, is the pre-political attachment to the country itself, which enables you to live on terms with neighbours whom you dislike. And this we can be tribal, it can be religious, it can be national, but it's no longer possible for it to be imperial, as it once was in this part of the world. And I think this is why the European Union has failed to create any lasting attachment to itself. It does not represent a pre-political attachment or a pre-political loyalty. Of the loyalties available in the world today, tribal loyalties are quite common, but they are nomadic. They don't depend upon being in a settled place. On the contrary, they are indifferent to the place. They are if you like, genetic rather than territorial, and therefore they tend to be disruptive, as we've seen in the Middle East. Religious loyalties, however, are universal. They're not just nomadic. They make a claim to universal allegiance and to overriding all local forms of sovereignty. But for that very reason, they are closed to compromise. And one of the great benefits of the Enlightenment that we've inherited is that we have freed ourselves from a pre-political form of religious loyalty. We live side by side with people who have of different faith, different vision of the world, and different fundamental beliefs, and yet we recognize a shared loyalty, and that loyalty is the national one, which is, put it simply, an attachment to territory and the customs and the language that have grown there. And in my view, this is the surest way to stability and peace. And this was perceived at the end of the 30 Years' War, when the nations of Europe signed the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, the third component of a believable conservatism to me is the trust in secular law. I say law which is not religious, but which is defined in terms of sovereignty over a territory. The disasters of the 20th century, of which you were very much victims, began with the destruction of law. Law became an instrument for controlling people, a set of orders issued from above, whereas real law is not that at all. It's an instrument for administering justice between people. It's something which grows from the resolution of their conflicts in the courts. And we know this especially in the Anglophone tradition, because we are governed by common law, which is created in the courts and not imposed on us from above. And the rule of law is inseparable from a territorial jurisdiction. That's to say, it's imposed over a territory, and it's the sovereign power which enforces the law over that territory. And it's what enables people in that territory to grow to trust each other, despite the fact that they might have different religious beliefs and different ways of life and so on. And I think we need to contrast this with holy law, in particular with the Sharia, which is often appealed to by Muslims as some kind of independent authority which would settle all the meaningless disputes among people due to their competition for power and so on. In fact, the holy law, as we've seen from the recent attempts to impose it, is in a certain measure unknowable and unadaptable. God sometimes reveals himself. Muslims believe that he revealed himself in the Quran, but even if he did so, he certainly didn't give enough instructions for leading life in the modern world. And yet, the Islamic jurists tell us, at least the Sunnis tell us, that the gate of ijtihad is closed, as they put it, that there is no way of adding to this law or adapting it. It's there for all time. God doesn't change, and the revelation cannot be displaced by any further revelation. And moreover, the law treats believers and non-believers differently. So this kind of law has become a source of conflict more than a solution to it. Ataturk perceived this, and it's why he dismissed the ulema, those who would impose the Sharia on the people of Turkey, and introduced a Western system of law borrowed from France and Belgium instead. And I think he was right to do that, and yet this is a major problem that we're now facing in our countries, especially in those which have large Muslim populations. How do we persuade them that the only law that can bring real peace and reconciliation between people in the modern world is a secular law, a man-made law? Because man-made laws, they can change with the decisions of those who are shaping them. The holy law will never change. And one of the benefits of secular law is that it defines the rights of the citizen. It says exactly what can and what cannot be done to us. And it lays this down according to an understanding of the human relations that grow naturally between people in a modern society. This, however, has also come under threat, not from religious law, but from what I call the human rights machine, which is a kind of international, global way of reflecting on law from a position outside it, inventing rights by the million, which are supposedly there to resolve human conflicts, and supposedly rights that we possess by nature and are not conferred by any civil jurisdiction. And this, I think, has kind of another kind of holy law. Civil rights are not the same as human rights. Civil rights are created by the law of the state, and they are part of the jurisdiction, part of what attaches us to each other and to the place where we are. Whereas human rights, especially in the European courts, have become sources of conflict. And it was one of the reasons why the Brexit vote in my country went the way it did, that people were rebelling against the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Anyway, that's a complex thing, but I think we can all agree that man-made secular law must be the foundation of any kind of reconciliation that we can achieve in the world as we know it today. The fourth component is representation. Now, there are vast questions concerning the meaning of democracy and how to secure it. And of course, philosophers and political scientists discuss this all the time. But just to simplify, for the sake of this talk, I think the crucial point is to recognize that it is not majority voting that we value, but representation. You know, majority voting can have the right result, it can reconcile people to each other, but it doesn't necessarily do so. Because it doesn't necessarily produce a government that is answerable or accountable to the people. A responsible government is accountable not just to those who voted for it, but to the people as a whole, including those who did not vote for it. And that is a very important thought. You know, the Communist Party, when it took over Hungary, did not regard itself as accountable to anyone except those who believed in its doctrine. The rest were to be disciplined into obedience, but their interests were not to be represented. And we've seen something similar happening in Egypt after the fall of Mubarak, when majority voting immediately produced a President Morsi, who thought that he represented those who had voted for him only. It was the majority that voted for him, but there were a lot of other Egyptians, Christians, atheists, skeptics, who did not vote for him, and Morsi thought that he didn't have any obligation to them. And of course, the result of this was that the army stepped in again to reassure or to repossess the political process in the interests of order. Something similar seems to be happening in Turkey too. And this, in a famous speech when he was seeking to be elected to Parliament, Edmund Burke made a distinction between a representative and a delegate. He said that a delegate is somebody who is appointed by a group of people to take their opinion to Parliament and to repeat that opinion there. A representative is sent to Parliament not to say just what his constituents say, but to use his own conscience and his own intellectual and practical faculties to produce a right decision, if he can. In other words, he's to represent their interests according to his own best conscience. And that means he may sometimes do things or vote in a way that they themselves would disapprove of. And representation in that sense has a history, and it's evolved to take account of evolving interests. And it's what our Parliament in Britain has always proudly boasted, that the members of Parliament do represent the interests of their constituents, the constituents being people in the place from which they've been sent, regardless of whether those people voted for their representative or not. This is unfortunately changing. We now see a Labour Party where the leader, the parliamentary leader, is not elected by the parliamentary party, but by the activists, and seems to have a very unclear idea of what his relation is to the constituents that send his members to Parliament. So this is a very fragile thing. One thing that one can certainly say is that it requires territorial attachment. You can represent people by territory, because that way you are forced to see all the interests that are at stake. But when you start trying to represent people by their religious beliefs or whatever it is, then the avenue is open to tyranny. Another component which I see as important is that of citizenship. The idea of the citizen comes out of the ancient institution of the city. In the ancient world, people moved from the countryside to the city, established these extraordinary vehicles of human cooperation, usually built around a temple and an open public space, in which strangers would mingle from all different areas and shape a new kind of relation to the world on which they were standing. And this idea of the citizen as the person who is responsible towards his neighbors and bears a kind of burden of belonging which they all share. This is, I think, something which is one of the great achievements of our civilization. The citizen, right from the beginning of the Greek polis, has been regarded as a participant in the procedures that govern him. He's not just somebody who is there to obey the law regardless. He participates in shaping that law. The law shields him to a certain extent, gives him the right to proceed about his business undisturbed in a society of strangers. And I think this is a most important feature of the European settlement, that we exist in a society of strangers and feel that we can trust those strangers because we are all shielded by our rights, and these rights are duly acknowledged. However, there is also a potential corruption here, that people claim these rights, perhaps rightly, but try to avoid the duties that come with them. And rights without duties are merely exploitation. I think the sense of duty is part of what makes a citizen into a responsible citizen, and therefore a true citizen. Many of the disputes about conservatism in our time concern the welfare state. Has the welfare state actually reduced the responsibility of the citizen, or is it something which can be accepted within limits as compatible with responsible citizenship. Many in America have written, many sociologists have written about this question, about the growth of the underclass of people dependent upon the state, but with no sense of responsibility towards it. And domestic politics in my part of the world is now homing in on this question. Just how do we reconcile the welfare state to the existence of responsible citizenship? And I think most people have come to accept that the welfare state is necessary in a large society such as we have, in which economic order depends upon predictability of day-to-day relations. Something like the welfare state is going to be necessary. But how do we reconcile that with responsible citizenship? So we need some kind of education for citizenship. And a citizen is not the same as a subject. A citizen freely participates in the political order. He doesn't just submit to it. And this means that we need a sixth component, a culture of freedom. Many historians have written about the rise of the individual, how in the Enlightenment, perhaps some people think much earlier, but at least in the Enlightenment, people began to think of the individual as the core component of a political community. That politics is not about the status of the sovereign and the order that the sovereign imposes. It's about the individual and his contribution and the freedoms that he can enjoy. And popular sovereignty is a fundamental part, therefore, of the post-Enlightenment worldview, that we are all participants in the sovereignty that governs us. And this is one of the guarantees that we have of our personal freedom. Now, the classical liberal position that was brought into, I suppose, brought about through the discussions of Hobbes and Locke and people like that, the classical liberal position was that we freely choose our government and that all legitimate institutions express a social contract, the contract that binds us to each other. But when people believed this in the late 17th and early 18th century, they took it to radical extremes, as did Jean-Jacques Rousseau, believing that perhaps each decision of the government must be subjected to the approval of the people. Perhaps the people have a sort of absolute sovereignty which permits them to ignore the minorities and to ignore their duties towards those who preceded them and those who are yet to be born. And Burke thought, in his great work on the French Revolution, that this explains why the popular sovereignty is always in danger of degenerating into tyranny. He said, we do, of course, exist under a social contract, but it's not a contract between the living only. It's a contract between the living, the dead, and the unborn. The living have the natural disposition to seize everything from themselves, to confiscate the inheritance, the things that have been handed down to them, and to confiscate also that which belongs to their successors. And one thing that helps them to do this is the emergence of an ideology, the ideology of freedom, rather than simply the fact of it. Beliefs about freedom which justify seizing property, seizing assets, and confining your opponents, what Robespierre called the despotism of liberty. So the endurance of this kind of freedom in which individuals are inserted requires a culture, requires the recognition that reasonable solutions to things emerge from an ongoing conversation, emerge by an invisible hand, as Adam Smith put it. That we don't achieve freedom by imposing radical solutions dreamt up in the heads of a small group of intellectuals. We allow people to negotiate, to make compromises, to engage in activities like the market, in which solutions emerge not from any particular person wanting them, but because they are the durable adaptation of the community. Finally, I think one of the components that conservatives in my part of the world have tried to escape from, and which I think everybody in the modern world finds difficult, is the component of sacrifice. Societies, if they are to conform to what Burke wanted, which is this communion of the dead and the unborn with the living, and they must reproduce themselves. Each generation must prepare the next. And that means that rites of passage are essential. It's essential that people learn to see not just the long term of their own lives, but also the need to sacrifice their lives for those who come after them. And this is what marriage and the family traditionally was. A family, you marry, of course, because you love, though not necessarily, but usually, and you commit yourself to the creation of a family and to passing on what you have to your children. And you recognize that the purpose of this institution of marriage is the children that will emerge from it, and they will demand the sacrifice that you must make in order to provide for them. And there is a reward in this, but nevertheless it's not because of the reward that you do it. You do it because the sacrifice is meaningful in itself. And this institution of marriage and the family cannot be arbitrarily remade at will. It's not an institution that exists for the benefit of those who decide to get married. It exists for the benefit of people who don't yet exist. And of course, this is one of the enormous problems that we've now confronted. It was a Conservative government in my country under David Cameron, which introduced the idea of gay marriage as a sort of reform, a necessary reform. And it's when he speaks about the things of which he is to be proud, this is what he mentions at the top of the list. And I think most ordinary conservatives will think, well, whatever that was not a conservative move. And there is a real question of, was it necessary? Nobody was asking for it either, except a few of his people around him in government. So this kind of thing is what we need if we are to restore some kind of transgenerational loyalty. And there are great difficulties that we experience in this today. There are difficulties as much in this part of the world as in Britain and America. And we can see the fight going on all the time, and the fight to preserve what we can of erotic commitment and what we can of the family as a source of social continuity. So there may be no political solution to this, however. So just a few remarks about the philosophical basis for all that. And all I've done is cobble together various components of the sort of conservatism that you see in my country and which you saw in America until the emergence of Trump, about which let's not speak here. But the question is there any philosophical basis for all this? My view is that it can all be justified in philosophical terms. And I've always thought that the fundamental point behind all those components of the conservative vision, the fundamental thing that we are striving for is autonomy. The autonomy of the individual who is able to govern his own life and to govern it responsibly. And that means he needs all kinds of institutions in order to do this. Institutions like marriage, like property. You cannot achieve the sort of autonomy that we have always wanted ever since the Enlightenment without property, the ability to close a door, or without gifts, the ability to bring someone to your side by making a sacrifice for him. Gift requires property in its turn. So, and there is a need for autonomous institutions. And this is something which Hegel, in his great work, The Philosophy of Right, attempted to justify, that the free individual only exists in a society where institutions also are free, where there are autonomous institutions, corporations, that he described them, which express the freedom of their members and also act freely in the forum of civil society. We need those institutions like the church, the schools, the universities, all the clubs and societies that my country is so good at producing, what Burke called the little platoons, which existed in this part of the world in abundance until Qadar in one year destroyed them all. You all remember that, don't you? Although you're all too young, of course, except for Mr. Horvath, who had to live through it. So that there is an underlying idea, and I think it's a very persuasive idea, that we individuals need our autonomy, and in order to achieve this autonomy, we need autonomous institutions. And there is also underlying this a Christian vision of redemption as something offered to all of us on condition that we forgive. All Christians in the Lord's Prayer rehearse a very fundamental fact, that we need forgiveness, but it will be available to us only if we offer it. That's what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. And that by obtaining forgiveness, we're in some way redeemed from all the troubles of this world. You don't have to be a Christian to think this, but it is a fundamental thought buried in the foundations of our civilization, that redemption is available through forgiveness, but forgiveness is available only if offered. And out of that comes a kind of society which will accept what I've just been saying in this talk, I think. And once that is in place, then institutions and enterprise all can sustain the society of strangers. And the great question for us in the modern world is, why does it break down?
I would like to bring in the Central European perspective. British conservative starts out from the tradition of his or her own country, and therefore he presents or she presents a story which is a nice story, perhaps with something of a decline at the end, but still full and uninterrupted story. A Central European philosopher has to talk about a story which is full of interruptions, full of breaks and breakdowns, in fact, full of tragedies. Of course, you were criticizing your own tradition. You were talking in a post-Brexit moment. You thought that the European institutions were perhaps one of the main causes that this happened. And in a way, you also showed that Britain is part of Europe. So in a way, you are yourself criticizing that majority which decided to leave the institutions, claiming that Europe is still a part of Britain, and Britain is a part of Europe. So in that respect, you were also criticizing your own history or your own country and your own politics. Let me do so as well. I think that we here are living in a post-communist world with this tragic history I mentioned earlier. And when you talked about the centralized state as the main contrast to conservative position, I would bring here the centralized state which was established by the party state in communist Hungary. And I think that perhaps the most important problem for us today, even after 26 years after the transition is that we still are in that shadow of the party state. And in fact, the points that you brought up might bring us some ideas how to get out of that shadow. You started out from a philosophical and anthropological concept. I will not deal with it because I agree with it. Then you mentioned three concepts which belong to your tradition, the British empirical tradition of conservatism, the nation state, the secular law, and representation. I agree with that again. I wonder whether it can be easily introduced in this country, although we are at the moment we are here in a building which belongs to the representatives and not the delegates, the representatives of this country's citizens. There were three major assemblies of the Diet of Hungary, which was convened here in this building. So we have got a tradition of representation and autonomy, self-government, but we lost it partly for our own faults, because of our own faults, and partly because of the external powers of our surroundings. But I think that it's still a momentous message that there are these ideas that we have to introduce. We learn it, maybe sooner or later we will be able to elaborate it and work better on it. But I would like to concentrate on two concepts that you mentioned. This is citizenship and the culture of freedom. First of all, because we are here in a district which belonged to the burghers of Buda. This was an ancient town in the Hungarian kingdom, but one which was dwelled by non-Hungarian speaking citizens of this country, burghers talking in German and still representing Hungarian feelings of belonging, of attachment. And this is something that was not, I think, appreciated by our political elites, that in fact there is a tradition, a living tradition in this city, in this quarter of the city, because I think that you have to start to work out your autonomous institutions on this small unit basis. And the burghers of Buda showed their heroic moments and their ordinary moments of work and work ethics. And I think that's the basis that you showed us when you talked about citizenship, the sense of duty, responsibility, and participation. The burghers of Buda knew that, and unfortunately the people who represented the country in this building were not accepting that sacrifice on their part. And the second point that I would like to refer to is the culture of freedom. Because indeed, it's not simply the institutions. You refer to the autonomous individual, that she requires institutions which would defend her rights, and together the two, the autonomous individual and the autonomous institution, will work well. But I think that there is a further point, and I think that your concept of the culture of freedom points to that, and that is political culture. It's not enough to have individuals who are courageous and morally motivated, who have got their own traditions and who are aware of their responsibility. It's not enough to have institutions that are well designed and according to standards, European or whatever. What you also require is political culture, to have a well-working community, political community, according to the conservative standards. And I think, as you again pointed out, education is a key idea in that. You have to work on the educational standards of your citizenry, otherwise they cannot just embody the ideas of your country. They cannot work well in those institutions that were designed for them. So education, but education cannot achieve everything. And you pointed out that there are some distractions which cannot be just healed just for one moment or in a few years. It requires a long time and patience and the sort of cooperation that you also implied. And I think that's very important, forgiveness. We live in a country which is very deeply divided because of the communist past and because of the political elites that can gain on that. And I think that this country cannot flourish if this division, this deep division, which is counterproductive as for the future of the country, as for the younger generations of this country cannot survive if this division cannot be breached and cannot be healed.
It is true that the autonomy that I esteem also will always be pushing against the boundaries that made it possible. And what makes it possible is the reproduction of a society in which autonomy is the norm. And it has pushed against those boundaries, and people do freely want, or some people freely want, to change the institution of marriage so as to, if you like, emancipate it from the reproductive meaning. And that has happened. But what the long-term consequences will be are as indicated in what you've just said. That it means that our population will decline and will be replaced by another population of people who don't have that sense of autonomy as their primary political experience, but rather submission. This is what Monsieur Houellebecq tells us, and he may be right. I would say first that I'm obviously speaking as a philosopher. I'm trying to say what conservatism is in its essence and ought to be in practice. Of course, secondly, I would agree with you that in practice it does not live up to the things that I've been saying. No political philosophy succeeds in living up to what it proposes. Because human nature is such a flawed thing. But there are particular difficulties that modern conservatives avoid. You've mentioned one of them, the growing inequalities or material inequality in modern societies, and the possibility that this will undermine people's trust in each other. That's one problem. The other problem was mentioned by George, that the freedom that conservatives esteem also erodes the institutions that make it possible. To both these, I would say that all politics is a kind of balancing act. You're trying to find a compromise between positions which are potentially in opposition to each other, but you're trying to maintain in being for as long as possible the equilibrium that you've inherited. It's like riding a bicycle. You have to keep going in order not to lose your equilibrium. Soviet system was based on the thought that we can do something to make people equal. And as you know, the result of that was that everybody was impoverished except for the party members who had 1,000 times the income of those of the others. It wasn't really a solution. My response would be to say that, okay, this is not a complete answer to the question of the modern world, but it is explaining some of the premises from which a complete answer would be constructed. You know, I'm not starting from the same premises as a socialist who begins from the premise of equality and moves on to the theory of the state as an equalizing machine, because I don't accept that, and I don't think equality is the fundamental premise. I think we do start from something else, namely the autonomous individual and the responsibilities that create him. So I have got a different starting point. But as you rightly say, as you enter the political arena, all these beautiful ideas become very corrupted at the edges. But you know, what else can you do? You can't stop thinking just because your thinking is not going to get you to the very conclusion. You've got to start from somewhere. Well, yes. My view is that the responsibility of a conservative, or a responsibility of a politician, is towards the nationals of his country, the people who elected him or her. And it's their right to say who shall be admitted and who shall not be admitted to the country. The fact that there are hordes of refugees from elsewhere is a problem to be dealt with. The question is, where do you deal with it? The left liberal response is that you let them in and try to settle them. My response is, no, you go to where the trouble is and try to settle them there, because that is where the thing that has to be cured, and it could be cured, and it's much less expensive to do it there. And you restore order across the whole global situation. Briefly, on the gay marriage issue, the question is not whether out of gay marriages some new kind of child nurturing can come, because of course it can, and it can come out of any kind of new relationship between people if it's made into something that people want. But nevertheless, what I was saying is that the notion of marriage was previously understood in terms of its reproductive function. It was not there to bring sexual comfort to the partners. It was there to produce the next generation. That was its essence. You know, so we are revising the conception of the institution. When I say that conservatism begins from love of what you value, of course that is a tautology, but it's very good point in logic to begin from a tautology. Because you know that you're saying something true. The question then is, what are you are you building your practical politics through the emphasis on what you love, or through the emphasis on the thing that you hate? And my experience as a conservative in the academy convinced me from the last 40 years that the leftist position is built on the hatred of people like me. It's not built on the love of the people whom they claim to be defending. On the contrary, when confronted with a member of the working class, most of my left-wing colleagues are appalled to discover that he actually thinks like me. You know, so that I think this difference of emphasis is a very important thing. I don't doubt what you say about the dangers of nationalist and religious and other kinds of conflicts. And it's one reason why I think we must hold on to the idea of the secular law and the autonomous individual as the crucial features of our politics. Don't let the national idea become an ideology, to become a kind of religion. Treat it simply as I was treating it. You know, the territory that we share. The great problem with Yugoslavia was that there were communities who refused to share it. As you rightly said, although speaking from a British perspective, I was speaking about a European inheritance. I don't think the European Union represents that inheritance. You know, I think it's the product of a fantasy itself generated by the two world wars. Perfectly understandable, but it's not applicable to what we are now. I think the Visegrad Four have a lot to offer, of course. I mean, you are Kulturträger. You know, you carry the weight of Central European culture and relay it to us. And I think you could do this more confidently and more aggressively than you do, you know, point out that this part of the world has something that elsewhere has been destroyed. You have beautiful cities, you know, like Budapest and Prague, Bratislava up to a point, you know, whereas Germany has only one or two. Our fault, we destroyed them, but nevertheless, you know, these are very important assets, and out of these assets you can produce an image of a secular European culture that all of us would envy. And in fact, we do envy it. Most of all, you have not seen your countries overwhelmed by mass migration, and your Prime Minister has courageously taken steps to prevent this. And as a result, drawn down on him all the venom of the European machine. But you know, if you hold on to that, you in Central Europe, to your attitude towards migration, and accept the kind of things that I was saying, you know, that the problem is elsewhere, not here, then you could serve as a model to us all.